Welcome to the Lost Debate, a show for political eclectics. I'm Ravi Gupta, and today we will bring back Idrees Kahloon from The Atlantic, who has written a series of thought-provoking articles. Most importantly, this article all about how Britain has somehow become as poor as Mississippi. It's counterintuitive, it's really fascinating, and actually this discussion happens as an incredibly important election is about to happen that could set in motion a leadership change in the UK. So you'll learn a lot about Britain and how they work and all of that, but also there's a lot of contours to this discussion that implicate us across the pond. And you'll find it really fascinating. I learned a lot by talking to him, not just reading that article, but like his spin on the article. We also talk about this movement that had existed in the US against standardized tests and how there's been a bit of a course correction. So if you stick around, we'll get there. And we've been partnering with Ed Reform Now, a nonprofit organization, to help bring more education content to this podcast. So shout out to the folks over there. Without further ado, let's jump into my interview with Idrees Kahloon. Idrees, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, your article caught my attention this past week. It was something like how Britain became as poor as Mississippi or something like that. And I have spent a lot of time in Mississippi. I started a school there, multiple schools, I guess, at this point. Mississippi's pretty poor. So I think when Americans think of Britain, they think refined. They think, Downton Abbey, the royal family, London, which is pretty clean and posh. But that does not seem to be the complete picture of Britain in 2026.
Yeah, that's right. In the same way that if you visited just New York or San Francisco, you would not get a complete picture of America. If you visit the UK and you just go to London, you'll see a thriving, amazing global city. But the parts that you don't really go to outside of London are doing a lot worse. And one of the things I wanted to get across in the piece was just how extraordinary Britain's economic stagnation has been. So since the financial crisis for about 18 years, wages after inflation have not gone up at all. Inflation has totally eaten away the wage increases that people have had. At the same time, the cost of living has gone up. Housing is really expensive. And this is true in London. Obviously, housing is expensive, but it's true outside of it as well. And so as a result, you have a situation in which living standards have stagnated, but at the same time, America's gotten richer, and that includes Mississippi. And so what we have now is convergence between some of America's poorest regions and the UK as a whole.
Yeah, and it's almost as if when reading your piece that in some ways Britain is living in what our 1970s were like in some ways. I think it was like a whole decade of wages that I actually think were negative in real terms back then. And as I was reading your piece, I was writing down all the potential causes here, and I want to like go one at a time. But for our listeners, these are just the ones I was writing down: austerity, Brexit, high energy costs, deindustrialization, bloated costs of infrastructure building, expensive and scarce housing. Those are just some of them. I'm sure there's more there, but why don't we go in order and start with austerity, and running back the clock. There are certain key moments in world economic history in sort of the medium term, one of them being the 2008 crisis and the other being COVID. How did Britain's response deviate from the United States here?
So the global financial crisis hit the UK quite hard because it had concentrated a lot of its economy into financial services into London. And that bet had worked out pretty well for it. So during the 90s, it was surging economically. It was improving relative to the United States. And, it seemed like things were going well. Labor had changed under Tony Blair and had become more comfortable with capitalists. Peter Mandelson, who was, kind of infamous now for being the ambassador to the U.S., who lost his job, but
Yeah.
he was quite an important labor politician at the time, quite important to Tony Blair's rise. And there's a memorable quote of his, which kind of set the stage for labor at the time, which was that he said that he was intensely relaxed about people getting filthy rich. That was the labor position at the time, and of course, the conservatives were still in their Thatcherite era. So anyway, this seemed like a good bet, but we have the financial crisis that hits incredibly hard, and so the idea that London could surge, but you can make up for the fact that the rest of England and Scotland, et cetera, was not doing as well by redistributing the profits. That compact didn't work anymore. So, afterwards, one thing that the UK did that differed from other countries was what we call austerity. So the idea that to get budgets back in line, they needed to cut spending and cut it aggressively. And, hindsight is 2020. We didn't realize what we were going through and when it would end. But, in hindsight, cutting spending at a time when interest rates were really low, when you were in a demand shock, when in fact, a Keynesian would suggest that you should borrow and spend. That all doesn't look like a great decision.
And just pausing there for a second for people who are listening to this. So what you're saying is, again, the sort of the Keynesian approach, would suggest that in the aftermath or during a recession and a crash or anything like that, that's when you increase public expenditures. You mentioned interest rates are lower, so everything's cheaper, right? We aren't really here to talk about the United States. What's interesting is we just do that during all times now. So it's
hmm
like we're spending beyond our means when times are good and when times are bad. But it seems like Britain got it exactly like the opposite here. Like they were cutting at a time when they should have been investing, is what you're saying.
Yeah, yeah. So if demand is depressed because of this crisis, and money is cheap because interest rates are really low, then you can borrow and you can spend and you can try to pull yourself up out of the recession. In analogous to what happened in America after the New Deal, and what happened after the financial crisis with Barack Obama, where people argued the stimulus that was passed then was not big enough. And I think, to your point, Biden probably overcorrected when dealing with COVID when he spent, $2 trillion on this American Rescue Plan, which is a lot of money, and for which the returns I think are kind of hard to spot, and at a time when costs were higher. But one thing the UK did was it cut a lot of spending on welfare. It didn't cut the NHS directly, but it did. It kept operational funds the same, but it allowed the capital budget to be borrowed from, so that wasn't being replenished. And that has led to a lot of the hospitals, literally crumbling in some cases. But the NHS as a whole, which was kind of the crown jewel of the British welfare state, if you remember the 2012 Olympics, there was at the center of the ceremony was this scene where like all the nurses descend. I mean, it's kind of like a national religion, the
And had been
veneration.
revitalized, if I understand, under Blair. I remember watching all of those prime minister's questions debate. I used to, it's weird, but I used to watch a lot of the prime minister question time with Blair because it was almost like an athletic experience. He was so good at it. And he spent a remarkable amount of time just quoting back, wait times are down, this procedure is easier, we've got more staff here, we got more staff there. He brought this kind of technocratic efficiency and ran on it. And had he not done the Iraq war, this would be what I think really Blair would be known for, from my rudimentary understanding of it.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's totally right. I mean, he was a really good administrator in a lot of ways, but the Iraq War was really the albatross around his neck. And some of those statistics have gone totally the wrong way now. So, wait time, I think 40% of people who arrive at emergency rooms wait more than 4 hours in the UK now. That's incredibly, incredibly common. You have wait times for elective surgeries, which include things like knee and hip replacements. Dentistry practices are really hard to get into, which has led to kind of more people using private care just to
And do it
access these
yourself,
services.
you mentioned. People are doing
Yeah.
do it yourself dentistry.
Yeah, there was a poll from 2023 that found that 1 in 10 Brits said that they were doing dental work themselves, which is just, not where you want to be as a country. But, they also cut the spending that local authorities could do, and that has manifested in a few ways. So local services have gotten worse because the amount that they receive from the central government has been cut dramatically, about 25. They don't have that many ways to raise revenue, and then at the same time they are legally obligated to pay for things like elder care, long-term care, et cetera. And they just don't have the ability to pay for it. And actually, this feeds into the NHS's problems because a lot of people wait and take beds in NHS facilities because there's nowhere for them to be released to. And so this feeds into longer waiting times, et cetera, et cetera. So, in a lot of ways, austerity is the root of the economic situation. But I think it's also led to a loss of political trust in establishment figures at the time, in elites at the time. I think that anti-elitism fed into the Brexit vote, which is the other thing that we'll get to. But in 2016, we saw that areas that had suffered the most under austerity were the most likely to vote for Brexit, most likely to say the European Union is a problem. And Brexit itself is a pretty big component of what's gone wrong here, right? Where you cut yourself off from the biggest trading partner sort of incompletely. So you end up in a situation where you have 4 years of business uncertainty, which is between when the Brexit vote happens and when the final deal is set. You have to agree to checks. You have to agree to accepting the EU's rules because you're not a strong enough negotiating partner to force them to change. But you don't have a say on them anymore. So, studies have found anywhere between 2 to 3% of GDP per capita is probably lost due to Brexit alone. That's you can debate the specifics, but Brexit itself is a harm that's caused. But I think the political roots of it also go to austerity. And then there are these longer running problems that Britain has had that are just not helping. So, since 1948, since the Town and Country Act, it's become incredibly hard to build new housing in the UK. Everything is an ad hoc negotiation. And so that means that housing in the UK is incredibly expensive for what it is.
You quote something like, what was the stat relative to France?
Yeah, France has a basically identical population, but has 50% more houses than the UK does. So, I mean, in some ways, it's supply and demand, right?
And, and we don't, it's not Singapore. We're talking about the French. They're not exactly, it's not like they're the model probably of housing concentration, but
Yeah.
that just tells you how bad things are. And what's going on here? I mean, I think you use the term proceduralism. Like, is this just a version of what we have in some blue cities, like here in New York City, where you talk about, for instance, it's not just housing, but it's also infrastructure spending, and you talk about things like this rail line. I think it's between Manchester, is it, and London, and how it's actually the most expensive rail project in the world, which I think we used to say was the second line subway here, but I guess. Is this just like a version? Because I see this in New York City. Everything's expensive. Housing, public infrastructure and all that. And the culprit is a combination of what you call proceduralism, which is a litigious culture with lots of rules and regulations and bureaucracy, combined with a sort of dominance of labor, has made things just super expensive.
Yeah, there are a lot of analogies to what makes it really expensive to build in New York to what's going on in the UK. You have all of these layered requirements. You have environmental reviews, right, which take a long, long time, which require very expensive mitigation procedures. Like one thing I mentioned in the piece is that HS2, this rail that was initially supposed to connect. It was a good idea, right? You connect London to Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds. It kind of fans out and then you can get from Northern England, which had not been doing as well historically, and be able to get people back down into London and back up, within 2 hours. That was the idea. It's now proven so expensive that they've chopped off the Manchester bit, which is probably the most economically productive bit. So it's now just a train from London to Birmingham. It's going to probably take 35 years total to be built. It's going to be the most expensive rail line in history. There's a bat shelter along the line, which costs 200 million pounds. In the nuclear plant that they're building.
Wait, let's talk the bat thing for a second, because I don't want people to miss what you just said. So there's some kind of endangered, I guess, bats. And look, we don't want bats to go extinct, I guess. But they had to build around it, I guess. Is that essentially what it was?
They couldn't build around the shelter, the habitat of the bat, so they had to build through it. And in order to avoid getting sued and having the whole project derailed, they had to build a special structure that allowed the bats to pass through without coming to harm, which added 200 million pounds to the cost. You see an analogy to America, like a lot of environmental review lawsuits proceed on the basis of like the sage grouse was kind of the infamous
Right.
one for like
Right.
pipelines in the Western United States. But you have a lot of those similar features that drive up the cost of producing anything. And that's big infrastructure, that is connection, that is electrical transmission lines, that's like housing, that's everything.
And you were about to talk about the nuclear issue, which is particularly acute because I think you say that this is the most expensive energy prices in the developed world is in Britain.
Yeah, yeah, they are extremely, extremely high. Britain does not, imports a lot of its natural gas, coal is not economical anymore. They used to have coal, but they don't use that anymore. They have net zero requirements that are pretty extensive as well. But nuclear power is they have some, but they any attempt to develop it further is really, really expensive. So they've been trying to build this nuclear power plant. It's going to take them many more years. It's on the site of two existing nuclear plants, but it's still a really costly mess for them. And the fact that their energy costs and electricity costs have gone up so much is a real hindrance to their ability to keep the manufacturing that they have. So they do have some facilities that are very good. Rolls Royce is still made there, for example. They do have a high value defense manufacturing, but all of that relies on having relatively cheap electricity because these are intensive use cases. If you want to attract data centers, AI usage, these kinds of things, you also need relatively cheap electricity. So that's a big deterrence for development. That they're experiencing, and people will experience it as well. Like people routinely will keep a little counter in their house to tally up how much energy they're using and what the cost is, in a way that utility costs are kind of top of mind, particularly after Russia invaded Ukraine and sent spiraling in a way that just really are not the case in a place like America.
And from what I understand, the French are actually another counterpoint here. They're pretty good at building nuclear, from what I understand.
Yeah. Yeah, they are. I mean, the Germans kind of went the wrong way, like shut off their nuclear plants and have really hurt themselves as a result. Especially, the idea was that they would import cheap Russian gas, they would make things, they would sell it to China. That model has kind of failed in a few directions. Obviously, Russian gas is not relied upon in the same way as it was, but also China is now really good at making cars, and so they don't necessarily need the Germans to make them their cars. So I think that the German economic model, not that that's what we're talking about, but it's also come under strain as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to find too many stellar examples of sort of strong business climates in Europe in general. Although I was in Dublin recently, and I had the thought, I'm like, this has got to be at the expense of England, like at London. Like there are all these tech companies, but also financial services companies, et cetera. Now I know a lot of that has to do with taxation, but I was just wondering, like maybe some of this has to do with the EU as well. Like I don't know, like what, like where did the concentration of business activity in the pre-2008 environment go? Like back to the US? Did it just never materialize and grow? Some of it go to Dublin? Did some of it go to Germany,
Yeah.
Paris? Like
No,
where is it?
it's a very good question. So yeah, UK still has financial services firms that do really well. So it's not lost those by any means, but I think it has deterred expansion. So London used to be really attractive because it was English speaking. It was a global city that talented people wanted to live in. They had good courts. They had access to the EU as well, right? So you could set up base there and move things Europe. And now Ireland is more attractive because it again is English speaking. Dublin is maybe not quite as attractive as London, but it's still a nice place to
I was
be.
shocked at how cosmopolitan it was. I
Yeah.
mean, it's not my brand of cosmopolitanism, but like every other person I met was from somewhere else in Dublin and working at a mega tech company or something.
Right.
It's almost overrun. I mean, the Dublinites, if that's what we call them, have mixed feelings about this. But I mean, they do seem to be doing quite well
Yeah,
as a city.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
think I think Dublin benefited. I think Paris has, Frankfurt, other cities just look to be a bit more attractive as a result of the EU decision.
Yeah. And so we're now at a fork in the road. The current prime minister, very unpopular, and he's getting it from both sides, if you will. Let's talk about the internal politics of the Labor Party really quickly, and actually the alternative model that we're about to see before we talk about reform.
Mm.
So you talk about the Manchester model. And so what's this, there's both an acute political significance to what's happening in Manchester, but also there's potentially an alternative governance model at work here.
hmm Yeah, and Manchester is very interesting because it is the city where growth is actually happening. So London is great, and it's very nice to visit. But actually, in London, productivity has been flat for almost 12 years. It hasn't grown more productive over time. It's only grown because of population and the housing costs are really high. Manchester is one of the few places where productivity is actually increasing, and that's happened for a few reasons. One is that part of it is kind of intentional. The BBC moved to Manchester a lot of its operations in around 2010, and that seeded a kind of development ecosystem that's centered around Media City. Now, GCHQ, the British Signals Intelligence Agency, also moved a lot of its operations to Manchester as well, and that has seeded its own bevy of mathematicians and scientists, civil service, et cetera. But Manchester's also been better about attracting businesses because it has benefited from London's increased costs. If you want to have white collar workers working in service sector jobs, you can do that in London. It'll be very costly, but you can do it in Manchester as well, and you can increasingly get a high quality kind of product and pay less. So Manchester's benefited from that. It also benefits, I think, from having two very good football teams nearby and driving tourism and those kinds of things. So the Manchester model has been one of the more optimistic places, but it's also not necessarily something that can be easily replicated in other parts of the UK because it's basically taken from Birmingham the title of the UK's second city at this point.
And how distributed is the sort of governance here? Because I think you read these different articles. There's the bus services or whatever, and I think for Americans, we're so used to federalism that this doesn't really compute. But from my understanding, localities have much less flexibility in Britain than in the United States, but Manchester has it more than others.
Yeah, that's right. So the UK is incredibly centralized. There's a grant that's given from the central government to the local council. That's the government that collects your bins and all sorts of other things. It's like hyper local service directly funded by the government. And there are exceptions to that, but they're relatively few. So some are the devolved nations. So like Scotland and Wales have their own parliaments and are able to make some decisions themselves. But Manchester is one of the few places that has had devolved powers within England, so it has a little bit more has much more capacity actually to to raise and spend money and to exert control over, like, for example, the bus service, which is one of the things that
Yeah,
Andy
they
Burnham.
painted them yellow, right, as like a
Yeah,
marketing scheme.
yeah,
And thus the rise of Andy Burnham, who I think most people listeners who are in the United States will not know this, but the mayor of Manchester is a former national labor figure going all the way back to the Blair days and has been the mayor, widely regarded as successful of Manchester, presiding over all the things you're talking about, and is running for parliament so that he can what?
yeah, so that he can replace Starmer. I mean, so Burnham's quite interesting. So he was, like you said, he was an MP for 16 years. He left to become the mayor of Manchester, which he's been for the last maybe 8 or 10
It's
years.
almost like Julius Caesar being like exiled to whatever, what did they call it back then? But the equivalent of Germany, I guess, and then
Yeah,
having to come back.
yeah,
It's like
yeah.
he was exiled to Manchester, is how it feels to
Or he
me.
went to Gaul. I mean,
Yeah, you
he's
go
from there.
France.
But
The
so this speaks to both Starmer's weakness, his tremendous unpopularity, by some measures the most unpopular prime minister the UK has had, incredibly ineffective despite the fact that Labour has a gigantic parliamentary majority. And the UK, parliamentary system means that Parliament's supreme. They can do what they like, and they haven't really been able to. So but he's not been able to use that at all. He's been really ineffective, really unpopular. The cast of characters who could replace him within Parliament, so MPs who could get rid of him and become the prime minister, are also seen as lackluster enough that people are looking to Burnham to come in, to come back into Parliament and become the prime minister. And initially, he wanted to do that. In February, there was a special election in a constituency in Manchester. He asked to run, and Starmer and his allies said, "No, you
I
can't
don't
do
even
that."
understand this part of your article. So why does it matter what Starmer says? Like, why does he need permission?
Because America's quite weird in having, saying, "Oh, I want to be the Democratic here," and then you get your chance. In the UK and a lot of other countries, the central party says you can or you can't. So it's up to them.
And so now they're allowing him to run. So Starmer sees the writing on the wall. He's allowing this to happen.
He's too weak to prevent him again.
Yeah.
So he's running in an election, which I think is in 2 days.
Oh my God.
It's in 2 days. And he's expected to win, although it's a district in which reform has done really well. So they put up their own candidate. who is probably he's at least slated to lose, but I think we'll have a good shot.
So
The
this is
idea
super high stakes. Like this
really
is
really high stakes. It's the most important election in UK probably this year. If he wins, then probably a leadership challenge to Starmer happens. Then probably Starmer's out.
it's widely assumed that if he wins, from what I understand, that he would be he would be able to take over. I guess that's what people are saying. Like at that point.
So then the procedures come into effect. So I think 81 Labour members of Parliament would have to say that they don't have confidence in Starmer. That would trigger a leadership contest, which would be up to the Labour Party to decide, and many candidates would then throw their hat in. So it wouldn't just be Burnham. Starmer could try to hold on and put his hat name in again. His former deputy prime minister Angela Rayner could do it. His former health secretary could do it. Ed Miliband, who's the environmental minister right now, could do it. So it would be very messy. It's by no means assured that Burnham would be the eventual winner, but the betting markets seem to think that, political insiders
Right.
seem to think that he would be the winner
I can't
eventually.
believe Ed Miliband is still kicking
He's
around. I
still
mean, I
there.
watched it when he beat his brother in the leadership challenge, which I thought was a huge fork in the road
I
for
mean,
the
some
Labour
people say
Party.
the wrong brother won.
I
And
think so. I mean, well, who am I? I don't live there, but just from where I was looking, I did some work with the other Miliband when I was at the United Nations under Obama, and he was the most impressive foreign minister. Of all the countries that we dealt with, he was incredibly gifted. I do not have the same impression of the brother, but it's like the U.S. It's like I say this to my friends in London. Watching Starmer hold on must be what it felt like to people who weren't in the U.S. watching our Biden dilemma, where it's like, how the heck is this guy running again?
Mm.
And they watched our sort of slow motion catastrophe that was, and I'm watching Starmer. And I listen to, Rest is Politics and all these guys who are just like, well, we can't. There's nobody good. I'm like, how is that possible? We don't have any good. So when I read about Burnham, I'm like, okay, this is interesting. And so, if Burnham becomes the prime minister, how long does he have until they have to call another election?
that would so they have 5 years from the last election, 2024. So not until 2029.
Okay, so it's a decent amount of time to get this right. It could be
Yeah.
a Carney situation in Canada, right? Like this can go in a lot of different directions, but that's the model, right? Take a very underwater, in that case Trudeau, like an underwater, sort of perception of the party and bring in a technocrat who's, very capable to turn around the image. What's fascinating is some of these systems allow for an outsider like this. Like if they're going to turn around, it has to be somebody perceived as an outsider. It seems like Andy Burnham has at least the opening to portray himself as an outsider.
Yeah, yeah. So he can. I mean, this is kind of extraordinary. I mean, the Caesar example is there, right? Like he's kind of returning
Yes.
from his victorious conquest in Gaul. He's crossing the Rubicon. I mean, this is very strange to have someone who is not currently an MP ride in, possibly become an MP, and then become PM very swiftly. I mean, that is itself a pretty extraordinary feat. Yeah, it's really it's really really something. And I think that you know Labor does not want to do another general election, right? They want to keep on to their 5 year
Yeah, they
term
get
first.
waxed probably, right?
Yeah,
If it held
exactly.
today. Well, that's a good segue into where we are right now, which is, you've got labor versus the conservatives as the traditional battles with lots of other parties that tend to form coalitions, et cetera. But now we have the rise of reform. And what is puzzling, but not surprising, given the lack of accountability we have in the US, is that somehow the party that gave Britain Brexit, which, as we've already established, has been incredibly costly to the economy of Britain, is somehow somewhat popular, or at least at its highest levels of popularity today than it's ever been.
It's leading in the polls, and it has for almost a year. So it's British politics has fractured over this period of time. So the traditional Labour conservative duopoly that has held power for over 100 years, that's broken right now. And Reform, which is a party led by Farage, which is pretty stridently anti-immigrant, but is Eurosceptical. It is analogous to MAGA republicanism, although it's different in important ways. That has been ascendant, and it has taken away a lot of Tory support. Labor has lost a lot of support to the Greens, who are the populist left party, which has done really, really well in cities. And a good number of their voters are also going to the Liberal Democrats. The whole thing has fractured. But right now, Reform is at about 27% of the polls, way ahead of other parties. And that matters because in a general election, Britain picks MPs based on first past the post. Whoever gets the highest number of votes is just made the MP. So even a lead that doesn't sound that impressive could translate, particularly if the political support is divided in the way that it is, into either a parliamentary majority or something very close to it.
You only
Such
need a plurality to be the prime minister?
if you have a plurality, you could then form a coalition government, probably in this case with the Tories.
Or you're given the opportunity, right? But then if you can't form the coalition, then things devolve again in some way, right? Is that kind of how it works?
Then someone else might be asked, or I mean, in other countries, when they've struggled to form governments, sometimes they have to call another general election in order to get a more resounding result.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's what was happening in Israel, where you had multiple elections in a
Israel, it
short period.
happens a lot in
Yeah,
Italy, Spain, Netherlands,
right.
more frequent.
I
Yeah.
mean, worth mentioning, we've had how many prime ministers over the past 20 years or 15 years? Just an insane amount.
So since Cameron, six, if you
Yeah.
include, so since 2016, six.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's incredible. It's like, what was it? It was Japan that were they probably hold the record where they were just could not pick a leader. And so you have Farage. So I think people like to analogize to other countries and our own country, right? And obviously, there is both a direct connection in the sense that he has an alliance with a lot of right wing figures in the United States. He speaks the immigration language. The immigration debate there is a little different because it's not centered around Mexicans and Latin Americans and Central Americans, but it's centered around Indians, Pakistanis, Muslims of any stripe, and probably Polish people. Is that basically the
So,
contours of the debate?
so it used to be about the Poles a
But the
lot
Poles are
because
richer now.
the
They're going to
Poles
be
are
richer.
rich, and a lot of them have moved back, right? So,
Yeah.
like pre-Brexit, a lot of the anger about immigration was about members of the Eastern European countries that had recently ascended who had moved to the UK, and there was antagonism about that.
They're going to miss those. I mean, I'm half Polish, so I'm half Polish and half English. So I guess I have resentment on both sides of this
Yes,
equation. But it's like they're going to miss the Polacks, which I know is like a derogatory term, but they're going to miss us because every time I go to Europe, I see increasingly confident Polish entrepreneurship community. The work ethic and just culture, I think, of Polish people has always been strong. And when you're looking to up your productivity and your entrepreneurialism, that is a group that they're going to miss.
yeah,
I think
yeah.
they've
I
gotten
think they
this wrong.
already do, and I think
Yeah,
what's happened since Brexit is that despite the pledges that Brexit would reduce immigration increased a lot, particularly under Boris Johnson,
yeah,
and immigration came from India, Africa, places where people brought their families, and there's a lot of anger basically at the scale of that transformation, and it's quite large. So it was equivalent, like 1 in 25 people in the UK came during this so-called Boris wave. And
yeah,
that's an extraordinary transformation. That is what's true in America, the UK, Germany, et cetera, is that when you have a big spike of immigration like that, you always have this inevitable political backlash that comes afterwards, right? It's almost like
right.
a law of politics at this point.
Yeah, and like I know that there's a lot of nuance to this. Like if you were to ask a Douglas Murray type, like there, he at least I would suspect would treat the sort of religious question separately. So he would separate out probably the Poles from the Pakistanis and the whatever and whatever. And obviously there's a debate about values and all of that. And I know having watched this recently that, whether it's in Northern Ireland or in various parts of England proper, there have been a lot of incidents and there's been a huge debate there, which obviously has I think, given Farage something to talk about. And so he wants a pretty restrictionist immigration policy. He's got this guy Zia Youssef, who's like the Stephen Miller, as you describe it, almost of Britain, but is Muslim,
Yeah.
which is like imagine Stephen Miller as a Muslim. I couldn't picture this.
Yeah,
Like,
it's interesting to me, right? Because when I saw him speak, when the night I was talking to Farage, he gives this kind of very angry speech. So Farage is like jolly. He's, a guy you want to get a pint with, and he always has that feeling to him, right? And in the same way that I think Trump, can cycle between these modes where he's, very funny and also can be menacing. But Z Yusuf has one mode, which is angry about a kind of existential invasion of immigrants coming to the UK. And what struck me was that, one thing he pledged in the speech was that there would be no churches that were converted into mosques, which is odd. I don't know how common this phenomenon is. I don't imagine it's very common. It reminded me a lot of actually Modi in India, where a big line from the BJP to whip up support among Hindus is to say that Muslims are coming and putting mosques on sacred Hindu sites. It's just kind of an odd thing, particularly for a Muslim to say, given that there are, whatever you think of the immigrants who are coming in now, there are British Muslims, and there have been for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Yeah, I went to India, quite extensively for a reporting project and went to some of these places in, Varanasi and et cetera, where they're making Ayodhya, where they're making, like,
Yes.
these big, and that stuff is like, like you sit my dad down, for example, who's kind of a Hindu nationalist, and they don't talk in terms of years, they talk in terms of centuries. So they'll be like, the Muslim invaders did this and this, and they changed this. And it's like, at a certain point, my head is spinning, and I'm like, good Lord. And obviously, they have some tools at their disposal there. We could talk about that forever to decimate the Muslim minority there. But getting back to Farage, he's not just defined by. So this is where I think, like, maybe this is what you're alluding to, and you said there's some key differences between Farage. He also is sort of seizing on this proceduralism and all that to talk about, making the government work better. To what extent do you think this is genuine, and what can they do to streamline all of this sort of nonsense that we're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, so going back to the one of the points that was made, Parliament can make a law and sweep away, these requirements very easily if it wants to. So in terms of what an empowered majority could do, they could do a lot. So they've identified legislation that they think is causing the problem: the Equality Act, Human Rights Act, Climate Change Act, which requires net zero requirements. So they've identified this. They've said that they want to clear out the civil service, and I think one reason why it's not surprising to me that reform is doing as well as they are is that they do have this program that promises to clean up the civil service, that promises to make government work again. Now, I don't know whether that'll actually be the case. They do have someone very smart in Parliament, Danny Kruger, who was a former Tory MP, very, very plugged into Tory networks, who was the first kind of defection to reform and led many other MPs to do the same. But he's the man in charge of thinking about what reform would actually do to government. And for people who blame really the Tories for keeping the Blair program and not correcting it, but really going along with it, adding these requirements further and further. A lot of them fail to see a difference between Labor and the Conservative Party. And when reform comes in and says, we're going to sweep all this away and we're going to do a much better job, they have, you know, comparatively more credibility on that front.
And who would be the prime minister for reform? Would it be Farage or
It,
somebody else?
it would be Farage.
It would
Yeah.
be Farage. Wow.
He's already an MP.
Wow. Okay. The To what extent, you didn't get into this, but there are two issues that are on my mind that you didn't really get into a lot, but that I'm just curious about. One is the Palestine issue. Like, to what extent is there a difference between reform and labor, and or I suspect the Green Labor division must have something to do with this. So that's sort of question one. And then two is the sort of the oligarch question. Like, I just finished London Falling, the Patrick Radden Keefe book, and it seems like post Ukraine, the oligarch money is out. That might just be a drop in the bucket, but have either of those two become salient political questions?
So the Gaza has come up, like you said, more between labor and green, where Greens are very loudly the pro-Palestinian party. They've campaigned like that. That's one of the reasons that they've done as well as they have in the cities, where there is a lot of anger against labor over its position on the war, and so they've really used that to their advantage, to the point that, in one of the elections they successfully had an MP win recently. part of her campaign strategy was to campaign. She had ads in Urdu that were talking about Gaza and Israel, and that was kind of striking for me to see. So it's mattered a lot there. On the oligarch question, I don't have a good answer for you. I don't know how much it does matter for politics. I know that Reform is quite interested in crypto and making London, kind of a cryptocurrency hub, and they have
Shocking.
support from
Shocking.
from several millionaires, billionaires, really, who provided money for them. So they're interested in that stuff, but I don't know how it interacts with the many oligarchs who call London home.
Yeah, I do have the sense also that we've exported some of our polarized media to London, and I watch every now and then some of these YouTube channels where they seem like almost copycats of the crazy shit that we have going on here in this country, like in terms of the way people are engaging.
Yeah, no, I think we have started exporting a lot of these ideas. We both like the kind of identitarian stuff, like Black Lives Matter taking off in places where there weren't even people of African descent, which is something you saw in Europe, right? America has this capacity to really influence the culture, and the fact that Donald Trump is our president, that we have this polarized media environment, I think has also affected other countries and
Right.
and how they react.
I was in Tuscany and I saw quite a few "Make America Great Again" hats.
Hmm.
It's like, what? By the Italian men. I'm like, how is this possible? Well, okay, while I have you, let's quickly talk about a totally different issue here, which is standardized testing in the US. You wrote a piece a little while ago, which, there's been some movement since, but essentially you were talking about, you were centering on the UC system. And as an example of this movement post Obama of universities around the country, and this really accelerated during the pandemic, de emphasizing, in some cases, totally disregarding standardized tests. And so let's just start with like how significant that sort of move was back then. Like, how many universities did this?
A lot of them during the pandemic said that they would not require standardized tests, and a lot of them kept that policy in place even after the pandemic had subsided and it become possible to take the test again. So there was a real move among particularly elite selective universities to de-emphasize testing and to say that they would, some universities said that you could submit it. Some university systems like the University of California said that we would not even consider standardized testing at all, and they have been some of the most steadfast holdouts. So they've kept that policy up until now. A lot of other universities in that peer group have since reversed themselves and have said that you have to submit an SAT score if you want to be considered for admission. The UC system, what prompted the article was that several math professors at Berkeley wrote a letter saying that begging for this to be reinstituted, at least for the students who are pursuing STEM degrees, because they had many students who were coming into their classrooms at introductory level mathematics who could not do even basic middle school mathematics. So people in calculus class struggling with algebraic expressions. That got signed by 1,400 STEM faculty. Last I saw, it's probably more now, in the UC system, who said, yes, this is absolutely necessary. People arriving to classes unprepared. The UC system says that they formed a working group and they'll get back to us in a year. But the movement is very much towards putting tests back in. But I don't know where you want to go with this.
Yeah, well,
There's a lot to unpack.
let me make a couple of quick points because we obviously don't have a ton of time to go through all this. But as you point out in your article, the arguments against the standardized tests were there was a COVID logistical sort of Trojan horse, but the real argument was these tests are somehow either racist or they're tools of inequality, because they would say that your performance on a standardized test correlates with your income or your race, et cetera. But as you point out, and we've pointed out a lot on this podcast, actually everything that universities use pretty much, whether it's essays, community service, GPA, et cetera, almost all of those things are correlated with income, standing, and actually a lot of the things I just mentioned more so than standardized tests. Is that right?
Yeah. High school GPA is a bit less correlated with income, particularly after grade inflation.
Yeah.
So,
It
so
doesn't correlate with anything anymore.
yeah,
Whether you exist on this planet, that's what it
exactly.
correlates with.
Exactly. But yeah. The knock against the SAT was that it had this correlation with income, and what the line of that thinking that I find hard to get my head around is I find it hard to believe simultaneously that there are serious imbalances in educational equality in this country, which a lot of people believe, which I believe, right? By race, by gender. So if you believe, not by gender necessarily, but race and income,
Yeah.
that's what I meant to say. If you believe that, if you administer a test, you should expect to see those race and income disparities, right? Like, it's not to say that you shouldn't do things to fix it, but if you attempt to measure it, you should see it, right?
Right.
So that's something that I've not fully been able to get my head around. But I think it's very tied in. You can see it from the statements that were made at the time of its passing. This policy that a lot of the background consideration is, what does this do about racial representation? So the SAT gives a strong number that's entered into admissions file. If you look at admissions rates by average SAT, and you disaggregate that by race, you will see pretty sizable gaps, right, between students of different races. And that was justifiable when universities could use affirmative action. University of California has not been able to since 1996, when referendum passed in California banning it. And also there was an attempt to bring it back in 2020, and it also failed.
Yeah, and to be clear, banning affirmative action, as you described.
Yeah, banning affirmative action. The elite institutions, Ivy League institutions, could say, well, we're doing affirmative action. But if you have a number now that's attached to every admissions file, and you still see the same pattern, someone could now sue, and I imagine that we'll see more of these lawsuits. Someone could now sue and say, you're discriminating by race in violation of what the Supreme Court said. So I think that, the fewer numbers that you attach to an admissions, application, the easier it is to do, I don't want to say backdoor affirmative action, but to do policies that ensure a racially balanced class.
Yeah, I'll dig it up. We'll put in the show notes a few times I talked to Jenny Sue Gerson about affirmative action, the affirmative action case that went to the Supreme Court. And, one of the many damaging pieces of information was the standardized test scores and how Asian students were being treated in the system, and how all these qualitative measures were somehow all lining up against them while the quantitative measures were in their favor. And that was like, if you ask people who, continue to believe, I know that case wasn't decided ultimately on that basis because they made a more broad ruling, but that was a pretty damning series of evidence that Harvard till this day is still not explaining. And, actually I was talking to some Harvard people recently who were like, well, the Supreme Court never said we were discriminating on the basis of race. And they were basically implying that the district court ruling that suggested otherwise was still in place, meaning like the district court that ruled in Harvard's favor. And I was like, yeah, well, the Supreme Court would have ruled against that if they didn't make a much bigger ruling.
Yeah.
They basically ruled all race-based affirmative action is unacceptable, which obviously encompasses the Asian American stuff. So, well, next time we have more time, we should talk more about this. But I think there's, as you point out in the piece, this is not a panacea. Like, bring the test back, there's still all kinds of problems. There's the growth of accommodations. There's in many cases, the weakening of these tests, even things like the LSAT. I was talking to somebody the other day about the LSAT, and I was shocked to learn that they took logic games out, for example. Like, they just keep, and the story they gave me seemed this could almost be an article, but like, that there was some subset of the population that couldn't do the logic games because of disability or something, so they got rid of all the logic games. I don't know if that's the true explanation or not, but that was what they were explaining to me. So there's like a weakening of standards across the board, obviously great inflation as well. And so in a world where you're only left with qualitative measures, it's actually the most affluent people who are going to game that system better than anybody else. So we really have there's a cacophony of problems to unearth here on the university.
I mean, on the SAT, right, in terms of gaming it, right, you had the scandal where people had to hire and pay people to cheat, right? Like, right. It's hard to cheat on it.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is really great. We'll point people in the direction of your articles in the Atlantic. Anything else you want to promote before we let you go?
No, thanks for chatting with me. I always appreciate talking through these things with you.
All right. Well, we'll get this up today so people can listen to this before this momentous election in the UK. Really exciting stuff. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much, everybody. Remember to rate, review, subscribe, throw a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast. Say something nice about us. Recommend us to your friends. We are on YouTube. So if you're listening to this on audio, go to YouTube. If you're on YouTube, make sure to hit subscribe. And you could also go wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe there as well. Thank you very much, everybody.